Samantha barely glanced at Naomi as she passed by, offering nothing more than a cold, dismissive, "We don't serve drinks before takeoff." Naomi tilted her head slightly, watching as the flight attendant moved on, only to immediately turn and flash a bright smile at the businessman across the aisle. "Would you like a pre-flight cocktail, sir?" The businessman chuckled. "That'd be great." Naomi's lips curled into a knowing smile as she calmly unzipped her sleek designer handbag. She pulled out a crisp, leather-bound notebook, its gold emblem glinting under the cabin lights. Without a word, she flipped to a blank page and began writing. Quick, precise strokes, each note carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Samantha's laughter with the businessman faltered. She stole a glance at Naomi, her breath hitching at the quiet intensity in the woman's posture. The air in the cabin shifted. Other passengers began to notice. The man who had just received his champagne frowned slightly, following Naomi's gaze to the notebook. Something was wrong. Then, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special guest on board today. We're honored to have our airline's CEO, Miss Naomi Carter, flying with us." Silence. Samantha's tray nearly slipped from her fingers. Her heart stopped. Naomi Carter? As realization crashed down on her, Naomi finally looked up, her deep brown eyes locking onto Samantha's, calm but unwavering. "You were saying," Naomi murmured, tapping her pen lightly against the notebook, "about how drinks aren't served before takeoff?" But before we dive deeper into this incredible moment, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss what happens next. Los Angeles International Airport pulsed with energy. A chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and hurried footsteps echoing off the sleek marble floors. The scent of fresh coffee and airport pretzels mixed with the crisp, conditioned air as travelers weaved through the terminals, some rushing with frantic urgency, others strolling with the ease of frequent flyers. A digital screen flickered above Gate 23, announcing an upcoming first-class flight to New York City. The boarding area was filled with a diverse crowd, business executives in tailored suits tapping away at laptops, influencers snapping last-minute selfies with overpriced lattes, and exhausted parents soothing restless toddlers. Every few minutes, the sharp voice of an intercom broke through the noise, calling for final passengers to approach the gate, reminding travelers to have their boarding passes and IDs ready. Near the velvet ropes of the priority boarding lane, a flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform flashed an enthusiastic smile at a sharply dressed businessman. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Davidson. We have your usual seat ready. Would you like a pre-departure drink?" The man chuckled, adjusting the cuff of his Rolex as he nodded. Behind him, a stylish couple in designer sunglasses chatted excitedly about their luxury hotel in Manhattan, their carry-ons monogrammed with high-end logos. The flight attendant's tone remained warm and inviting, her body language relaxed, her enthusiasm effortless. But as another passenger approached, the warmth dimmed just slightly, almost imperceptibly, unless, of course, one was paying close attention. Naomi Carter was standing just a few feet away. She observed it all with quiet precision, her expression unreadable. At 52, she exuded the kind of confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Dressed in a fitted, elegant navy jumpsuit and low-heeled pumps, she carried herself with effortless grace, every movement deliberate yet unhurried. A designer handbag rested on her arm, understated but impeccably crafted, with a tiny, nearly hidden emblem stitched onto the side, an insignia that very few would recognize. Her sleek, shoulder-length, silver-streaked hair framed sharp yet kind features, her deep brown eyes scanning the interactions unfolding around her with the kind of patience that spoke of years spent studying people. She didn't need to be in a rush, she had time, and more importantly, she had awareness. As she watched the flight attendant greet each passenger, she noted the subtle shifts in tone, in posture, in presence. The businessman had received immediate attention. The influencer couple had been showered with charm. But when a woman with a heavy accent approached with a slightly worn carry-on, the flight attendant's energy changed. The smile remained, but it didn't reach her eyes. The tone was still polite but clipped. practiced rather than genuine. The woman hesitated for just a second, as if sensing the invisible divide between how some were welcomed with effortless warmth and others with measured tolerance. Naomi's lips pressed together slightly, though the change in her expression was barely noticeable. This wasn't new to her. She had spent a lifetime witnessing these subtle yet telling interactions, the quiet separations of who was perceived as important and who was merely tolerated. It wasn't about explicit rudeness, it was about who received effortless courtesy versus who had to earn it. A voice at the gate interrupted her thoughts. "Boarding first-class passengers, rows 1 through 4. Naomi stepped forward with quiet confidence, handing over her boarding pass with a polite nod. The flight attendant barely looked up, offering a quick, impersonal welcome aboard before shifting her focus to the next guest. No warm greeting, no friendly exchange. Just a transaction. Naomi accepted it without reaction, but the detail was noted. As she walked down the jet bridge, the cool air conditioning hit her skin and she exhaled slowly. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't offended. She was just waiting. Samantha Hayes adjusted the cuff of her neatly pressed uniform, her polished appearance matching the precision of her movements. She had been a flight attendant for nearly a decade, confident in her ability to read passengers at a glance. It was an unspoken skill, the way she could instantly assess someone based on their attire, posture, and energy. Wealthy businessmen were often curt but appreciative, influencers expected attention, elderly travelers required patience, and young professionals like herself responded best to efficiency. She prided herself on her ability to provide excellent service to those who fit the first-class experience. Her smile widened effortlessly as she turned toward a middle-aged man in a tailored suit stepping aboard. "Welcome, Mr. Kensington. We have a fresh cocktail waiting for you if you'd like to unwind before takeoff." She gestured smoothly toward his seat, her voice light, warm, and polished with the ease of someone who had delivered the same greeting 100 times before. The man chuckled, appreciative of the attention, and made his way down the aisle. Behind him, a blonde woman in a sleek designer dress pulled off her sunglasses, flashing a dazzling smile. Samantha's energy brightened instantly. "Miss Taylor, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. I absolutely adore your bag. Is that the new limited edition?" Miss Taylor beamed, lifting the purse for Samantha to admire. "It is. I had to get on a wait list for months, but it was worth it." Samantha let out a soft laugh, shaking her head playfully. "Well, it looks stunning on you. Enjoy your flight." The warmth in her expression was automatic, genuine, but selective, because then came another passenger, one she barely acknowledged. Naomi Carter stepped forward with quiet elegance, handing over her boarding pass without a word. Samantha took it with a polite nod, her demeanor shifting so subtly that most wouldn't notice. But Naomi did. The charm was gone. The friendly enthusiasm, the personal touch, the small talk reserved for those deemed worthy of extra attention, all of it disappeared in an instant. Samantha didn't do it intentionally. In her mind, she was just being efficient. The woman was well-dressed but unremarkable, quiet but not engaging, poised but not inviting conversation. There was nothing about her that signaled she required special treatment, and so Samantha gave her exactly what she thought was necessary. Nothing more, nothing less. A simple, detached, welcome aboard. Naomi didn't react, simply stepping past her toward her seat with an unreadable expression. Samantha barely noticed. She had already turned her attention back to the next passenger, an older couple struggling with their carry-ons. "Let me help you with that," she said sweetly, reaching out to lift the bag before they could even ask. As she moved effortlessly from one interaction to the next, she remained completely unaware of the pattern she had just revealed, the unconscious bias woven into every greeting, every glance, every interaction. Naomi had seen it, but Samantha, she hadn't even realized it had happened. Naomi settled into her seat with effortless grace, placing her handbag beside her and glancing around the cabin. The atmosphere was comfortable, the soft hum of the engines vibrating beneath her feet as passengers stowed their bags and settled in. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, adjusting blankets and offering last-minute assistance. Naomi exhaled softly, then leaned slightly toward the aisle just as Samantha passed by. "Excuse me," she said in a calm, measured tone. "Could I have a glass of water before takeoff?" Samantha barely paused, her expression neutral but distant. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't serve drinks until after takeoff." The words were automatic, dismissive, spoken with a practiced finality that signaled there was no room for negotiation. Without waiting for a response, she moved on, her attention already elsewhere. Naomi sat back, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet sharpness in her gaze as she watched Samantha continue down the aisle. The rejection hadn't surprised her, not really. What did intrigue her, however, was how quickly Samantha's demeanor shifted the moment she reached the next passenger. Across the aisle, a white businessman adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit and gave Samantha an easy smile as she approached. "Long flight ahead," he remarked casually. "Any chance I can get a glass of champagne before we're in the air?" Samantha's expression brightened instantly, the cool professionalism she had displayed moments ago melting into warmth. She let out a soft, almost conspiratorial chuckle, tilting her head. "Well, technically, we're supposed to wait until after takeoff," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "But for you, I think we can make an exception." Naomi watched as Samantha turned without hesitation, retrieving a flute of chilled champagne from a tray near the galley. She presented it with a smile, her tone effortlessly engaging. "Enjoy," she said, giving the businessman a wink before moving on. Naomi's fingers brushed against the cover of her notebook, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't need to write anything down immediately, the moment was already imprinted in her mind. The contrast had been so stark, so effortlessly revealing that it was almost amusing. Almost. She reached for her pen, opening the notebook with the kind of ease that suggested this was far from the first time she had observed something like this. Her handwriting was fluid as she jotted down a few brief notes, her expression calm, unreadable. The cabin hummed with quiet conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from passengers sharing stories of their upcoming plans in New York, but Naomi remained still, absorbed in her silent observations. She had asked for something simple, nothing extravagant, nothing difficult, just a glass of water, and yet her request had been dismissed without thought, while the man across from her, with his easy charm and expensive watch, had been accommodated instantly. Naomi closed her notebook and set it aside, folding her hands neatly in her lap. She didn't look upset, didn't look frustrated. She simply looked like a woman who had just seen something important. She had all the time in the world, and she was watching. As the flight settled into a smooth cruise above the clouds, the flight attendants began their meal service, gliding through the aisles with trays of carefully plated dishes. The scent of warm food filled the cabin, a comforting contrast to the crisp air conditioning. Naomi watched as passengers around her received their meals, the process seamless, efficient, as expected in first class. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been served champagne earlier received his plate with a friendly nod from Samantha. "Here you go, Mr. Foster," she said warmly. "Let me know if you need anything else." He smiled, already unwrapping his silverware, diving into his meal without hesitation. Naomi waited patiently, her hands resting lightly on the armrest. One by one, the other first-class passengers were served. Samantha moved with precision, engaging some passengers with light conversation while handing others their trays with quick efficiency. Naomi remained seated, watching, waiting. A few minutes passed. Then a few more. She glanced down the aisle and noted that the attendants had already moved on, checking drink refills, offering additional condiments, ensuring every guest had exactly what they needed, except for her. Her table remained empty. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't clear her throat or call attention to herself. She simply observed. The realization settled over her, slowly, predictably. 15 minutes passed before Samantha finally made her way back down the aisle, her tray nearly empty now, only a few meals left. She paused when she saw Naomi's untouched table, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face before she forced a quick, professional smile. "Oh, I'm so sorry, I must have overlooked your order," she said, her voice laced with artificial politeness. "Let me grab that for you right away." Naomi met her gaze steadily, expression unreadable. She gave a slow, measured nod. "That would be appreciated." Samantha turned sharply on her heel, disappearing toward the galley. Naomi let out a soft breath, barely noticeable, then flicked her gaze around the cabin. other passengers had noticed. The businessman across the aisle, now halfway through his meal, had cast a glance in Naomi's direction when Samantha apologized. A younger woman 2 rows ahead briefly looked back, brow slightly furrowed, before returning her attention to her tablet. An older couple nearby exchanged a quiet glance but said nothing. No one wanted to interfere, no one wanted to be the person who pointed out the obvious. Samantha returned a few minutes later, setting down the tray in front of Naomi with the same strained smile. "Here you go," she said quickly, before turning away, moving down the aisle as if eager to put the moment behind her. Naomi looked down at the meal. The plate, once steaming and fresh when served to the others, was now lukewarm at best, the presentation slightly off, the sauce congealed at the edges. The bread roll, which had been warm and inviting on other trays, was now firm and unappetizing. She let it sit there for a moment, untouched. Then, with deliberate ease, she reached for her notebook. Her pen moved slowly, carefully, as she noted the sequence of events. The ignored request, the delay, the way the mistake had been corrected not with care but with reluctant obligation. She didn't look up at Samantha. She didn't need to, because Samantha wasn't watching her. She was avoiding her gaze entirely. Naomi sat still, the cool air circulating through the cabin brushing against her skin. The temperature had dropped slightly, the usual adjustment made to keep passengers comfortable. She noticed others pulling blankets over their laps, nestling into the plush seats with quiet contentment. She reached for the call button but then reconsidered, instead choosing to catch Samantha's attention as she passed by. When the flight attendant finally strode down the aisle, Naomi lifted her chin slightly and spoke in the same calm, measured tone she always used. "Excuse me, could I have a blanket, please?" Samantha barely glanced at her, barely paused. "We're limited on blankets, ma'am," she said briskly, her voice carrying the same detached efficiency she'd used when denying Naomi a drink earlier. "They're usually reserved for passengers who request them ahead of time." And just like that, she was gone. Naomi remained motionless, absorbing the moment. The words themselves weren't the problem, it was how they were spoken. The flatness, the subtle irritation, the unspoken assumption that Naomi's request was an inconvenience, an unnecessary disruption. She exhaled slowly, then turned her gaze back to the cabin, watching, waiting. It didn't take long. Just 3 rows ahead, a woman, blonde and well-dressed, adjusted in her seat and flagged Samantha down with an effortless wave of her manicured fingers. "I'm freezing," she said, laughing lightly. "Could I grab a blanket?" Samantha's response was immediate, fluid, natural. "Of course, let me get that for you." Within seconds, she had retrieved a fresh, neatly folded blanket and placed it in the woman's lap with a warm smile. "Let me know if you need anything else," she added before walking away. Naomi didn't move, didn't react. But when Samantha passed by her row again, she turned her head just slightly, her voice smooth but firm. "So some passengers deserve comfort more than others." The question hung in the air like a slow-building storm. Samantha froze for half a second, just long enough for anyone paying attention to notice, before she forced a casual shrug. "I do what I can, ma'am," she said dismissively, her voice clipped, final. Then she walked away, assuming that was the end of it. But it wasn't. A few seats away, a black couple exchanged glances, their eyes heavy with understanding. The man exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat, as if considering whether to say something. The woman pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening around the armrest. They had seen it before. A young Latina woman, barely in her 20s, whispered under her breath, "I know that feeling," before shaking her head and turning toward the window, as if trying to escape the quiet discomfort settling over the cabin. A businessman 2 rows up who had been scrolling through his phone suddenly looked uneasy. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and glanced toward Naomi's seat before quickly averting his gaze. He said, "Nothing." No one did. And Naomi? She simply picked up her pen and started writing. Naomi sat still, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. But she was watching. Samantha moved through the cabin with practiced ease, tending to passengers with warmth and familiarity. She leaned down to chat with a young couple traveling for their anniversary, laughed at a joke an older gentleman made about airline food, and eagerly assisted a man struggling to connect his Bluetooth headphones. She poured refills of wine, adjusted seat positions, and even knelt down beside a woman debating between two meal options, offering her personal recommendation with a charming smile. But she never once looked in Naomi's direction. It was deliberate. Naomi had seen it before. The silent avoidance, the subconscious retreat, the way people distanced themselves from discomfort without even realizing they were doing it. Samantha had made the mistake of treating Naomi differently, and now, rather than correcting it, she was pretending it hadn't happened at all. Naomi let the moments pass, her fingers resting lightly on the cover of her notebook. She wasn't upset. She wasn't even surprised. She was simply absorbing it all, taking note of the way Samantha seemed perfectly at ease with her choices, convinced that there would be no consequence, no fallout. The cabin hummed with quiet conversation, passengers lost in their own worlds. But Naomi remained locked in this unspoken exchange, one-sided as it was. She flicked open her notebook, her pen gliding across the page with effortless precision. Each word she wrote was sharp, deliberate, factual. There was no emotion in the way she documented the events, just truth, a request ignored, a delay unaddressed, a dismissal unnoticed by all except those who had lived through it before. Samantha passed by again, her tray now empty, her demeanor still light, still bright. She laughed at something a passenger said, her voice carrying over the low murmur of the cabin. Naomi glanced up, catching a glimpse of her expression, completely relaxed, as if this flight had been no different than any other. Naomi made one last note, then closed her notebook with a soft final snap. She settled back into her seat, her gaze shifting toward the window. The sky stretched endless and open, the sun casting long golden streaks against the clouds. It was quiet, still, but not for much longer. The soft hum of the cabin continued as passengers settled into the rhythm of the flight, the occasional clink of glasses and quiet murmur of conversations filling the air. Samantha moved easily from row to row, chatting, pouring drinks, smiling as if everything was perfectly normal. But it wasn't, and someone else had noticed. A voice, clear and firm, cut through the comfortable lull of the cabin. "I've been watching, and it's obvious you're treating her differently. Why?" Silence. Samantha, halfway through handing a drink to a passenger, froze for just a fraction of a second before recovering, her movements stiffening ever so slightly. She turned toward the voice, an older black woman seated just a few rows ahead of Naomi. Her expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable weight behind her words, the kind of directness that came from years of experience, from seeing this same pattern play out over and over again. Samantha blinked, her lips parting slightly as if she had misheard. Then she let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head. "Excuse me?" The woman, unfazed, tilted her head slightly. "You heard me. You've been catering to every other passenger in this cabin like they're VIPs, but when it comes to her," she gestured toward Naomi without breaking eye contact, "you can barely look at her. You ignored her drink request, you forgot her meal, you denied her a blanket when I saw you give one to someone else not 10 minutes later, so I'll ask again, why?" A ripple of awareness passed through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some glanced toward Naomi, others at Samantha, and a few exchanged quiet, uncertain looks. Samantha's smile turned rigid, her grip tightening on the tray in her hands. "Ma'am, I assure you I treat all of our passengers with the same level of courtesy." The woman scoffed, unimpressed. "That's funny, because it sure doesn't look that way." Samantha's eyes flicked around the cabin now, noticing that others were watching. Some passengers had been silent witnesses to the entire flight, seeing the moments in isolation, but now putting them together like pieces of a puzzle. Naomi, meanwhile, remained completely still, her face unreadable. She did not intervene, did not react. She simply watched. Samantha let out a short breath, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. "I'm sorry if there's been a misunderstanding, but I assure you I have done nothing wrong." The woman arched an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Samantha rolled her eyes, her patience thinning. "I have a job to do and I don't have time for baseless accusations. Now, if you'll excuse me, you always this dismissive when someone points out the truth?" The words came not from the older woman, but from a man seated across the aisle. He was in his late 40s, sharp-dressed, his tone casual but laced with something sharper. "Because I've been watching too, and she's right. You've been treating her differently. You just didn't think anyone would notice." A murmur spread through the nearby rows. More people were paying attention now. Samantha's cheeks flushed a deep red, her professionalism slipping. "I don't have to stand here and justify myself," she snapped, her voice rising, just enough to make a few passengers sit up straighter. "No one asked you to justify yourself," the man shot back. "She asked you to explain. Big difference." Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Naomi finally moved. She closed her notebook, deliberately, softly. The sound was small, almost insignificant, but in the heavy silence that had fallen over the cabin, it felt deafening. Naomi looked up, her deep brown eyes locking onto Samantha's, and then, for the first time since boarding the plane, she spoke. Not just to Samantha, but to everyone. "I was never looking for an apology," she said smoothly, her voice even, steady, "but I do think it's important to recognize when patterns start to form, because they always do." Her gaze remained fixed on Samantha, who swallowed hard, her hands tightening around her tray. "And the problem with patterns," Naomi continued, "is that once people start noticing them, it's much harder to pretend they don't exist." The tension in the cabin was suffocating now. Samantha's breath was uneven, her usual confidence crumbling at the edges. Naomi didn't need to say anything else. She had already won. The cabin, once filled with quiet conversation and the soft clinking of glasses, now simmered with something far heavier. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some exchanging glances, others pretending to ignore the unfolding scene but listening intently nonetheless. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on the air, thick and undeniable. A man in business casual leaned toward his seatmate and muttered, "She really thought no one would notice?" A young woman across the aisle shook her head slightly, her arms crossed. "We all saw it. She just didn't expect to get called out." Samantha's face flushed deeper as the whispers spread like wildfire, her grip on the tray tightening until her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded in her chest, embarrassment and frustration warring beneath the surface. She had controlled the flow of this flight effortlessly just an hour ago, moving through the cabin with ease, confident in her ability to navigate any interaction. Now that control was slipping through her fingers, unraveling one thread at a time. Her patience snapped. "I have done nothing wrong," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, sharper than she intended. "This is completely out of proportion." No one answered her. She turned, eyes locking onto the older black woman who had first spoken up. "You don't know me," Samantha said, her voice tight. "You don't know how I do my job. I treat everyone fairly." The woman didn't flinch. She just exhaled through her nose, her expression unimpressed. "If that were true, we wouldn't be having this conversation, would we?" A low murmur of agreement rippled through the surrounding passengers. Samantha's breathing turned shallow. She scanned the cabin, looking for support, an ally, a single familiar face that might validate her, but every gaze she met was either skeptical, concerned, or outright disapproving. Even her fellow flight attendants, standing near the galley, exchanged wary glances but made no move to intervene. They looked uneasy, unsure of what to do, caught between their duty to the airline and the undeniable reality unfolding in front of them. Daniel, the younger flight attendant who had noticed Samantha's treatment of Naomi earlier, shifted uncomfortably near the beverage cart, his hands tightening at his sides. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but he hesitated. Naomi, however, didn't hesitate. She simply watched. Her silence was not passive, it was controlled, deliberate. She had no need to raise her voice, no need to argue. Everything she needed to say had already been said, and the truth had spoken for itself. Samantha's breathing was uneven now, her frustration turning to desperation. She turned to Naomi, grasping at anything to regain control. "Are you seriously offended over a blanket?" she scoffed, her voice dripping with forced amusement. "Or was it the water? I can get you one now if it'll make you feel better." The words were meant to be dismissive, to reframe the situation as petty, but they landed with a dull, heavy thud in the silence. Naomi's gaze remained steady, unwavering. She let the question hang between them for a beat before replying, her voice calm but firm. This was never about the water. Samantha's lips parted, but she had no response. She had already lost. A sudden chime from the intercom cut through the thick silence of the cabin. Conversations halted mid-sentence, forks paused over half-eaten meals, and even the background hum of the engines seemed to fade into nothingness. The captain's voice came through, steady and composed, carrying the weight of authority that no one could ignore. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest on board today. We are honored to have our CEO, Miss Naomi Carter, flying with us. Silence. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a vacuum of sound, a moment so heavy it seemed to stretch the air tight around them. Samantha went completely still. For a long second, her mind refused to process what she had just heard. The words replayed in her head in fragments: CEO, Naomi Carter, special guest. But they made no sense. They couldn't. Then the weight of it hit her like a freight train. Her hands trembled against the tray she was still holding, fingers gripping the edges so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. She felt her stomach drop, her chest tighten. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold despite the warmth of the cabin. Passengers turned, their gazes swinging from Naomi to Samantha in slow, dawning realization. Some eyes were wide with shock, others with newfound respect, but most were locked onto Samantha, waiting to see what she would do, how she would react. Samantha couldn't move. Her breath was shallow, uneven. The weight of every decision she had made during this flight crashed down on her at once. The ignored drink request, the delayed meal, the blanket she had so easily handed to someone else, the dismissive tone. The way she had barely acknowledged Naomi's presence because, in her mind, she hadn't needed to. And now, standing there, she realized Naomi Carter had needed nothing from her. Not a drink, not a meal, not a blanket. But Samantha had needed Naomi far more than she had ever realized. Her eyes darted toward Naomi, desperate to gauge her reaction, to grasp at any sign of mercy. But Naomi was simply watching, composed, silent. There was no anger on her face, no smugness, just knowing. Samantha's heart pounded violently in her chest, her breath shallow, her world tilting under the weight of the truth. She had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. The weight of the announcement settled over the cabin like a thick fog, pressing down on every passenger, every whispered thought, every unspoken realization. Heads turned toward Naomi, eyes widening in disbelief, admiration, and for some, guilt. The man across the aisle, the one who had been served champagne before takeoff without hesitation, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tightening around his glass. The older black woman who had spoken up earlier nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. The young Latina woman pressed her lips together, her gaze flicking from Naomi to Samantha, an unspoken "I knew it" flashing in her expression. Samantha was motionless, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. She had been fighting against something intangible this entire flight, avoiding, dismissing, denying, and now the truth had slammed into her with such force that she felt physically unsteady. She tried to move, to adjust her posture, to do something to regain a sense of control, but every muscle in her body felt frozen, like she had been locked in place by the weight of her own choices. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, an excuse, an explanation, anything to erase the reality that had just been laid bare. There was nothing. Near the galley, Daniel exhaled sharply, the sound cutting through the heavy silence. Unlike Samantha, he didn't look shocked, only resigned. He had noticed the subtle injustices throughout the flight, had seen the way Naomi had been treated, but like the others, he had stayed silent. Now, as the reality of who she was settled over them all, he gave Naomi a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of what she had endured, with quiet dignity. Naomi met his gaze, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them. Then, with the same measured grace she had carried since stepping onto the plane, she turned her attention forward again, as if the moment had already passed, as if the revelation meant nothing at all. But for everyone else, it meant everything. Naomi turned slowly, her gaze settling on Samantha with quiet precision. She didn't need to speak immediately. The weight of the moment was enough. Samantha stood stiffly, her hands still gripping the tray as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse thundering in her ears, but she couldn't look away. Naomi's voice, when it finally came, was smooth, unshaken, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be forced. "Why should it matter who I am?" she asked, her tone neither confrontational nor cruel, just a simple question, one that cut through every excuse, every defense Samantha might have clung to. "Every passenger deserves respect." Samantha swallowed hard, her throat tightening as something inside her cracked. The sentence was so simple, so obvious, and yet it held the full weight of every moment in this flight that Samantha had brushed aside, dismissed, ignored. The water, the meal, the blanket, the way she had convinced herself over and over again that Naomi was just another passenger, one she didn't need to go out of her way for, one who wasn't worth the extra effort, the warmth, the care. Samantha blinked rapidly, trying to force back the sting in her eyes. The realization was suffocating. It pressed into her chest, made her stomach twist. She wanted to explain, to justify, to say something, but what excuse could possibly matter now? She had treated Naomi differently. She had thought she could get away with it, and she had been wrong. The cabin was still, the air thick with a silent understanding. Naomi didn't move, didn't press further because she didn't need to. The lesson had already been delivered. A soft murmur rippled through the passengers. Someone let out a breath they had been holding. A man near the front of the cabin nodded to himself as if absorbing something deeply personal. A woman whispered, "She's right." Then, slowly, almost uncertainly, someone clapped. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just a quiet acknowledgement, an understanding, a moment of respect. Another passenger joined in, then another. The applause remained soft, but the meaning behind it was deafening. Naomi didn't react to it. She didn't need to. She had already made her point. Samantha, however, felt it settle into her bones, into the spaces she had ignored for so long, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would never forget this moment for the rest of her life. The applause faded into a quiet hum of shifting emotions, unspoken realizations settling over the cabin like dust in the air. The black couple who had exchanged uneasy glances earlier now nodded subtly, a silent acknowledgement that they had seen this happen too many times before. But this time, for once, someone had been held accountable. The woman placed a gentle hand over her husband's, squeezing it lightly, as if to say, "This one ended differently." A few rows ahead, the young Latina woman let out a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders easing. She had been watching, had been feeling the quiet injustice unfold in real time, had felt it echo in her own experiences. But she had done what so many others had, kept her head down, said nothing. And yet, Naomi hadn't needed to raise her voice, hadn't needed anger or theatrics, just poise, just truth. The woman smiled softly, feeling something deep inside her shift, like permission to believe that dignity alone could be powerful. Even the businessman across the aisle, the one who had barely glanced at Naomi before, now sat with a tight jaw, his expression unreadable. But it was clear he had been forced to reconsider something, maybe not just about Naomi, but about himself. He had enjoyed his complimentary champagne without a second thought, had assumed it was normal that some people were treated better than others, and now, for the first time, he wondered why he had thought that way. His fingers drummed lightly against the tray table before he finally exhaled and looked away, his face tinged with something uncomfortably close to shame. The cabin had shifted, the energy was different. Naomi remained still, unmoved by the reactions around her, but not unaware of them. She had seen it all before, the way people processed these moments, the way they wrestled with their discomfort. Some would learn, some would forget, some would pretend it had never happened. It wasn't her job to change them. Her job was already done. Samantha felt like the air had been sucked out of the cabin. Her chest was tight, her hands trembling as she gripped the tray she no longer needed. The murmurs of the passengers, the weight of their stares, the deafening silence from Naomi, it was all too much. She had never felt this exposed, this seen, and not in the way she had always wanted. Her mouth was dry, her throat constricting as she forced herself to look at Naomi again. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't so much as shifted in her seat. She was watching, waiting, not for an apology, but for the weight of reality to sink in. And it did. Samantha's breath hitched as the full weight of the past few hours slammed into her. The moments she had dismissed as unimportant were now inescapable. Every time she had chosen indifference over kindness. Every time she had made a silent judgment. Every second she had made Naomi feel less than, it all replayed in her mind like a cruel, unforgiving reel. Her vision blurred, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe, but the words felt too big, too heavy. She gripped the tray harder, then finally let go, setting it down on the nearest counter as if it physically weighed her down. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." The cabin remained still. Naomi didn't react right away, didn't rush to comfort her, didn't tell her it was okay. Because it wasn't. And Samantha knew it. The silence stretched, long and agonizing. Samantha wanted to shrink under it, wanted to disappear, to undo every decision that had led to this moment. But she couldn't. All she could do was stand there, raw and exposed, hoping, praying that somehow she could make this right. A soft shuffle of movement caught her attention. Daniel, the younger flight attendant, stepped forward. He didn't say anything, didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed, but his presence alone steadied the storm raging inside her. Then, in a quiet, measured motion, he placed a hand on her shoulder, not as an absolution, but as a sign that redemption was still possible. Samantha exhaled shakily, closing her eyes for just a second, letting the moment settle deep into her bones. She had been blind before, but now she saw everything. Months passed, but the weight of that flight never left Samantha. It stayed with her in the quiet moments, in the stillness of her apartment at night, in the reflection she caught in the mirror before every shift. It wasn't just guilt, it was understanding. A painful, necessary understanding of how easily she had dismissed someone without realizing, how effortlessly she had decided who was worth her warmth and who wasn't. She hadn't been a bad person, but she had been blind. That was no longer an option. She threw herself into learning, devouring every article, book, and documentary she could find on unconscious bias in customer service. She attended seminars, sat in on discussions she would have ignored before, forced herself to listen when it made her uncomfortable. And when her airline announced a new diversity and inclusion initiative, she was the first to volunteer. She wasn't just looking to correct her own behavior, she wanted to make sure no one else on her team made the same mistakes she had. During training sessions, she spoke with an honesty that left people silent. She shared her experience, the moment she had dismissed someone who turned out to be her own CEO, the shame of realizing she had judged someone based on nothing but her own unspoken biases. Some flight attendants shifted awkwardly in their seats, others nodded in quiet recognition. She knew what they were feeling, because once she had been just like them. And now she saw everyone. On flights, there was no longer a difference in the way she greeted passengers. She offered the same kindness, the same warmth, whether they were dressed in designer suits or worn-out sweaters, whether they spoke with polished accents or broken English. She took the time to learn names, to notice small details. She made sure no one ever felt invisible under her care again. It was a quiet change, but a powerful one, because this time she was paying attention. Naomi sat by her office window, the late afternoon sun casting golden streaks across her desk. The hum of the city below faded into the background as she opened the envelope, her fingers tracing the neat handwriting on the front. She recognized the name immediately, Samantha Hayes. Unfolding the letter, she took a slow breath and began to read. "Miss Carter, I don't expect you to remember me, but I will never forget you. That fly changed me. At first I told myself it was just a mistake, a misunderstanding, that I had simply been too busy to notice how I was treating you differently. But the truth is, I did notice. I just never thought I needed to question it. You didn't call me out. You didn't humiliate me. You simply held up a mirror, and what I saw in my reflection shook me to my core. I used to think good service meant efficiency, professionalism, and a polished smile. But now I understand it means seeing people, really seeing them. Not just the ones who demand attention, not just the ones who look like they belong, but everyone. I've spent the past few months unlearning habits I didn't even realize I had. I've changed the way I work, the way I see the world. And that's because of you. You didn't just teach me about service, you taught me about humanity. Thank you, Samantha Hayes." Naomi let out a quiet breath as she reached the last words, her fingers resting lightly on the page. A soft, knowing smile touched her lips. She folded the letter carefully, setting it aside as she gazed out at the skyline, her eyes reflecting something deep, something steady. Then, almost to herself, she whispered, "One step at a time." How often do we judge before truly seeing someone? How many times have we walked past a stranger, made a snap decision about who they are, what they deserve, without ever speaking a word to them? We convince ourselves it's harmless, that it's just instinct, just efficiency. But the truth is, these small, quiet choices shape the world we live in. They dictate who gets kindness without question and who has to prove they are worthy of it. This isn't just a story. This is reality for so many people. Maybe you've experienced it firsthand. Felt the subtle shift in someone's tone, the polite but distant smile, the way warmth is reserved for some while others receive only the bare minimum. Maybe you've witnessed it, sat in silent discomfort as someone was dismissed, ignored, or treated as invisible, unsure if it was your place to speak up. Or maybe like Samantha, you've never noticed until one day you do. And that's the thing about awareness. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Naomi didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to demand an apology or lash out in anger. She let the truth speak for itself, and when the truth is undeniable, it forces change, whether we're ready for it or not. So what does that mean for us? It means we have a choice. Every day, in every interaction, we can decide whether we uphold the same silent biases or whether we challenge them. We can choose whether we see people or whether we look through them. We can choose whether respect is something we only extend to those we deem important or whether it is something we give freely to everyone, because that is what dignity demands. This isn't just about a flight attendant. This isn't just about a CEO. This is about all of us. Have you ever witnessed discrimination like this? What would you have done? Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed silent, hoping someone else would? Let's start the conversation. Share your thoughts below, because these stories, your stories, matter. The more we talk about them, the more we make it impossible to ignore. And remember, respect shouldn't be a privilege, it should be a given. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Every conversation, every shared experience, every moment of awareness brings us one step closer to a world where respect is not selective, where kindness is not conditional, and where dignity is not a privilege, but a right. Your voice matters, your actions matter, the way you treat people, whether they are a stranger on a plane, a coworker, a neighbor, or someone you'll never meet again, matters. Together we can create a world where no one has to fight to be seen, where respect is given freely, not based on status, not based on appearance, but simply because everyone deserves it. So the next time you find yourself in a moment like this, ask yourself, what choice will you make?